people always ask you, well, what do you do for a living? That's like a common question. I say, well, I'm a hypnotist. And the next question, what do you guys think is the most common question that occurs when somebody tells you they're a hypnotist? What do you think the next question is every time, no fail? And I've been keeping track for 30 years. The next question is, does hypnosis work for X, Y, or Z? Does it work for quit smoking? Does it work for weight loss? Does it work for this or for that? It's always the question. And depending on the setting, I'll tell people, look, rather than asking, does it work for X, Y, or Z, in the way that we would ask about medications and pharmacology, right? In pharmacology, the question is, does this compound work for this kind of problem? That's the way they phrase the question. What I prefer to do is to have a conversation with people about what hypnosis is, hopefully how it works, if we understand how it works, and then we can infer from that understanding what it can be used for. I think it would be a lot more useful here today to discuss a little bit about what it is, how it works, where it comes from, and then you can answer the question yourself. Well, does it work for weight loss? Does it work for relationship issues? Does it work for, then you can answer those kinds of questions yourself. It's like if I told you that I have a knife here, pretend you have never seen what a knife is, and I described how it works, how it's made, then you can answer to yourself the question, does it work to cut steel? Does it work to cut metals? Does it work to cut meat or vegetables? You can answer those questions knowing what it is and how it works. So this idea of hypnosis has a very, very, very interesting history. It goes back about 3,000 years. We have some papyri from Egypt, going back literally some 3,000 years, describing hypnosis pretty much the same way that we practice it today. It's fascinating how old and ancient this idea is. And for the entire 3,000 years history of hypnosis and hypnotherapy, it's been controversial, it's been attacked, it's been ridiculed, and it has saved untold number of lives and people and situations. I mean, it's been a miracle for some people, but it's also been the object of ridicule and shame and all kinds of things, right? So it's a very, very polarizing topic. Some people love the whole topic of hypnosis. They want to hear all about it. They want to experience hypnosis. Other people, you mentioned hypnosis, they might as well equate you to the devil. It's like, how can you get into these kinds of things? How can you, in other words, it does draw some really polarizing emotions from some people. 3,000 years. And throughout those 3,000 years, it started off as a spiritual practice. You see, the Egyptians way back when were very much concerned with the idea of the other world. If you look at all this papyri that they left us, all of these inscriptions in rocks and stuff, they were very much concerned about connecting the physical world to the world beyond, the spiritual world. This whole idea of the afterlife, the underworld, the upper world, and all of these ideas of this non-physical world were very much ingrained in the learned class of the Egyptians, the pharaohs, the magicians, the kinds of people that they talk about in the Bible, in the Old Testament, that learned the class, the intellectuals of the time. They were very much concerned with the afterworld. And they discovered somehow that under certain circumstances, the way your mind works shifts completely. Now, it's interesting. One time I was doing a class and I gave this group of students an example. I said, imagine that I'm an alien and I come here from another planet. And in my planet, imagine, there's no such thing as an airplane, but we do have buses. Imagine. So when you look at a bus and an airplane, they look somewhat similar. They're both long tubes. They all have wheels. They both have wheels. And they both drive around the ground. So if in my planet we have buses, but I arrive in this planet and here they have airplanes, I would sit in one of those airplanes and I would think, well, this is very similar to what I know. It's like a bus. It has wheels, it drives around, it's a tube, people sit in seats, very similar. This is a bus. You might ask, well, what are those things sticking out of the sides of this bus? I say, oh, it doesn't matter. We can probably clip them off if they don't do anything. Just like certain organs in the body are unnecessary, so we think. So the idea is, if we start driving the plane around, as you all know, you've all been on a plane, and under certain maneuvers, certain kind of acceleration, a certain kind of maneuver, that airplane behaves as something much more than a bus. It actually flies. You all know this. But the guy who came from another planet wouldn't know that. That person would get into the plane and simply drive it around because that's what he knows, a bus. Well, we are born and we all imagine. And as a kid, we dream and we see things and we have imaginary friends and we see things and we do things and we all know we're going to grow up and be successful until we start learning otherwise. We go to school and they tell us what's possible and what's not possible. And therein begins the hypnosis of life. So when people talk to me about hypnosis not being real, I say, dude, just look at our lives. Of course it is real. We've all been hypnotized to decrease what we really are, because we're all way more than we seem to be. But we've been hypnotized to believe that we're less. And it started very early in life. Don't do this, you don't deserve that, you can't do this, be careful, you're going to fall. If you fall, you're going to break your head, this, that, and that. And so the hypnosis of life begins very early on. And so by the time we become adults, by the time we're educated, we went to high school, we graduate, and now we know that we're merely a bus. We can no longer fly, even though we have the wings, even though naturally we were meant for something completely different, but we've become conditioned to driving around like a bus, in the analogy of the bus in the airplane. And it's interesting because I've read over the years those kinds of experiments that people do. Martin Seligman, I'm sure you know him, he did a whole lot of work back in the 70s and 80s on this idea of learned helplessness. This idea that if you condition a person to be a victim, they started off with something a little bit more reasonable, like lab animals, like rats and stuff, and they would give them electrical shock. And, if you put a rat in a cage and you give it an electrical shock, but you also give it the means to turn it off, the lab animal develops this idea of agency. Wow, I can actually improve my situation. I can turn off this electrical shock. And they will do something to be able to turn that thing off. They learn. But if you rig the apparatus in such a way that they cannot turn it off, they stop trying. And that's called learned helplessness. How many people do you know, not anybody here I know, but how many people do you know that have become helpless? In other words, they've accepted the way they live as life normal. It's the way life is. We all have been there. I've been there. We have all been. We're all there because we're all meant for way more. So when a person comes to see me and they say, I want hypnosis to do A, B, or C, that is what they have on their mind. They're looking for a reason to make the phone call and to come in. They're saying, well, maybe I need to quit smoking. Maybe I need to lose some weight. Maybe I need this. Maybe I need that. But in reality, something within their spirit has already awoken to the fact that they're meant for more. And what we're really asking is, can you remind me of who I really am? And that reminding will never happen by me telling them. I can tell you, oh, listen, you're meant for more and you can do this and you can do that. We can do this motivational conversation and it pretty much proverbially goes into one ear and out the other. Studies show that motivational talking has a very, very short lifespan. You can go into one of those seminars and you can dance and you can be all pumped up and you leave the seminar feeling like you're it. But a week later, a lot of people are literally in a depression. There's like a rebound effect there and people have this depressive symptoms. And so motivation as an outside-in phenomenon is very short-lived. It's interesting, it's fun, but it's very short-lived. There's something very different that happens when a person touches that spark of divinity within themselves. And that process, that way of touching that spark of divinity cannot be done from the outside in. It will never happen by a hypnotist or any one of us reminding one another that we're awesome. That will never happen. It has to be by them releasing the previous limiting thoughts that they had about themselves and seeing it for themselves, what's inside of them. And I don't mean organically inside, I mean spiritually and mentally. And that process of releasing what I thought I was and seeing what I actually am, that process is how we understand hypnosis, how the Egyptians understood hypnosis. But then the history continued, right? We started off in Egypt about 3,000 years ago. You got time. We'll get to the present. Don't worry. You went through all of these incarnations, hypnosis, right? And by the time we got to the Roman period, about 1,000 years later, by the time, in the 300s, the Roman Empire basically fell, and the world changed. When Constantine accepted Christianity as the religion of the land, everything changed, because then Christianity went from being a mystical tradition to being an institutional religion, quite literally. These are historical facts. Everything changed. First thing they did is they started burning all the books from the Greeks. So the whole thing that you went to school and you studied about Socrates and the Greek philosophers and all of this knowledge that these people had accumulated, the Egyptians, all of these previous cultures were thought to be, well, this is all pre-Jesus, therefore it's not true. And they systematically burnt and destroyed all of that culture, giving rise to what later came to be known as the Dark Ages. Now we cannot do anatomical dissections anymore, even though they did that in ancient Greece. We cannot see how the body works, and disease and pestilence became the way of life. People were dying of all kinds of things because we cannot study things, we cannot learn things. The Dark Ages. So during the Dark Ages, hypnosis also went underground, and it became a religious phenomenon. For those of you who are familiar with the Catholic Mass, for instance, the way they build those rituals, you would recognize in certain rituals, in certain religious rituals, you would recognize all of the principle of hypnosis. Hypnosis. And hypnosis was practiced in monasteries by monks, and we have evidence of this, but under secrecy, because it was a secret idea. So much so that by the mid-18th century, now we're talking 1764 or so, this man who was a priest, his name was Maximilian Hell. Now, I always smile, I cannot help it, because he was a priest, and his name was Maximilian Hell, H-E-L-L. I've always thought that, history is full of these kinds of coincidences, which I find fascinating. Well, this guy was the director of the astronomical observatory in Vienna. What was Vienna back then? Vienna was the capital of the world, not literally politically, but Vienna was the place you went to learn. The University of Vienna was something much bigger at the time than Harvard is today, because the world was smaller back then, you see. So Vienna was like it. All of the royalty were in Vienna, all of the universities were in Vienna. Vienna was it. This guy was the director of this observatory. He was a Catholic priest, and for a lot of people are surprised by this. The Catholic Church has a number of astronomical observatories. And this is interesting as a historical parenthetical comment, because a few years earlier, Galileo Galilei was threatened with death for actually looking through a telescope and observing that, he was the first to suggest that the Earth actually goes around the sun. Nowadays, some of the biggest and best observatories are actually owned by the Vatican. It's just one of those coincidences in history. But Maximilian Hell knew about the influence of the planets on health and knew about the idea of magnetism. So he had, back then, the process of instruction was conversations between masters and disciples, much as it is in some areas today. So he had a pupil, a disciple, a student called Anton Mesmer, Franz Anton Mesmer. And Mesmer was a medical doctor. He graduated in 1766 from the University of Vienna as a medical doctor. And I say this because some people think that Mesmer was a loser. There were no loser at the University of Vienna back in the 18th century. This did not happen. These people were all elite intellectuals, all of them, because this was the University of Vienna. Studying medicine wasn't easy back then. So this guy was a physician, and he was also, in parallel to his academic career, he was a student of the mystical arts under Maximilian Hell, and he learned about the effect of magnetism on health, and he developed this idea that with magnets we could cure certain illnesses. Now, that was the time when physics was evolving. Faraday, all of those guys, Maxwell, were developing all of these equations on how physics and magnetism worked. So to differentiate the phenomenon that he was talking about from magnetism as people knew it back then, he called this phenomenon animal magnetism, to differentiate it from the idea of mineral magnetism. In other words, the magnets that you know today. So this was the only word that the Mesmer had. And what he was really talking about is this idea of energy transmission. He thought, and he demonstrated, that by certain movements of the hands and by applying intention from his mind, he was able to direct energy. We didn't have a name for that energy. The guy did a lot, so he called it animal magnetism. But the idea was that we can transfer this energy from body to body, and with that energy, alter the way that mind worked. And he proved this. But of course, he wanted the patent. He was from Austria, and he was working in France. And he was a foreigner, basically. And he sort of discovered something that was changing the course of humanity. Because back then, you got to remember, medicine back then was nothing like you know of today. They didn't have stethoscopes. The first tool the medicine developed is the stethoscope. That didn't come until 1843. René Laennec, a French physician, developed the stethoscope. Does anybody know how he came up with the idea of the stethoscope? I love this story, and the students always get a chuckle out of it. He was a physician, but he was very short, overweight, and he was very shy around the ladies. So as a physician, one day he had to listen to the heart of a female patient who was reputed to be very well endowed in her upper body. And so he was embarrassed to put his ear to her chest, which was standard medical protocol back then. So he thought about it. How could I listen to her heart without putting my head to her chest? And he developed a tube that he could do that with, and that became the stethoscope. So sometimes some of the most amazing inventions comes from shy people and embarrassment. Got to solve the problem somehow. Anyway, that didn't come until 100 years later. I'm only illustrating to you how primitive by today's standards medicine was. So a person had gout, which was very common back then. Their toes would be hurting. They had no medicine. There was no, they could do nothing. They would be hurting. They would be suffering miserably. Well, Mesmer found a way to help those people with animal magnetism, and on and on and on. But of course, he wanted the patent. So as an Austrian, the queen was reluctant to give him the patent. And he says, look, let's create here a French institute, and you're going to be the director of the institute, and we can assign the patent to the institute. So that way the French people won't think that we're giving away this prestigious award, to a foreigner. Anyway, there's a political problem there. And as a result of that, Mesmer was able to convene a large delegation of scientists at the time. Dr. Guillotin was there, the guy from the French Revolution. Antoine Lavoisier, the chemist, and even Benjamin Franklin, the one that you carry around in your pockets in abundance. That guy was the head of that commission, over 20 scientists at the time. And they were studying this idea of animal magnetism. Now, remember what I told you? Mesmer was a foreigner. So instead, what they did is they went to his clinic and spoke to one of his disciples, Monsieur Desmond. He was a student. He wasn't a master yet. And they said, okay, you do this animal magnetism stuff, and they studied him. They couldn't quite demonstrate the existence of animal magnetism, and the report from the commission, which I read it to all of my students in English, showed that, well, the stuff doesn't quite exist. We cannot detect it. To this date, we cannot quite detect it. It's not quite so easy. Later on, the Russian Kirlian came up with the Kirlian photography. We can see some rays of energy. Not so easy to measure exactly what Mesmer was talking about, not even nowadays, much less back then. So they pronounced that this idea of animal magnetism as being nonsensical, and a war ensued. This was known historically as the pamphlet war. It's like, okay, the pamphlet war. People would be writing pamphlets and papers all the time. Is it real? Is it not real? Is it real? Is it not real? And that went on for quite a few years until Mesmer died in 1815. But by then, hypnosis had already taken off because people discovered, James Braid was a surgeon, a Scottish surgeon, discovered that you could induce the same state that Mesmer induced by making waves and magnetic waves and all. You could induce that with words alone. And so in 1843, he publishes a paper that establishes the modern use of hypnosis as we know it today, not from the Egyptians, but today, using only words, only spoken words to induce the hypnotic state and effect therapeutic change. So this stuff goes back to 1843. And I mention this because other professions that we think of today as being established and official professions did not come about until much later. The chiropractors, for instance, I'm a student of the chiropractors. Dr. David Daniel Palmer discovered the idea of moving vertebral bodies and all this, back in 1895, but the profession wasn't quite established until about 15 years later. The profession became established as we know it today. So hypnosis was already established way earlier. Psychology, of course, is from the 19th century, is much, much more recent. But what these other professions did that the hypnotists never did is they organized. They formed these political bodies. They established licensure laws in all states. I think psychologists got licensure in all 50 states in America as recently as 1977. I believe Missouri was the last state. So this was quite recent that, there was a state license to practice psychology just the other day. But at least they did it. The hypnotists never did it. So hypnotism is still the subject of some controversial comments and some jokes and so forth. Now, all of this time, I told you all of this story to emphasize one thing. This entire time, the idea of hypnosis was centered on the idea of spirituality, starting with the Egyptians, the Roman period with this idea of religion and so forth, and later the idea of the mind. Incidentally, people always ask me, well, what about psychology? How come they're not hypnotists? Well, one of the people that had a lot to do with the founding of psychology was, of course, Freud, Sigmund Freud. And he was a hypnotist because he was interested in neurosis, and he learned hypnosis from a French hypnotist, another neurologist called Jean-Martin Charcot in France, in Paris. So he went to Paris to study hypnotism with Charcot. He learned hypnosis and went back to Vienna, another physician from Vienna, and he started practicing hypnotism. But it's an interesting fate of history, He wrote several papers, of course, Freud, and in all of his papers, we extract 3 different comments as to why he thought we shouldn't continue using hypnosis. The first comment that he made against the use of hypnosis for therapy was, it doesn't work for everyone. I find that comment to be so ironic because nowadays, according to published data, the success rate of hypnosis for therapy is higher than the success rate of conventional talk therapy. I mentioned all of the studies in my latest book, but this is according to their data, not my data. It's higher, 63% versus 50%. But Freud said, well, it doesn't always work. Okay, what do you know of that always works for everything? Nothing does. Okay, second, he said something interesting. He says, well, sometimes you hypnotize a person, they get better, but later the symptom returns. Well, have you ever taken a painkiller? Like you buy them at the store, you take one, the pain goes away, then the pain comes back. That doesn't prevent us from buying another one later. So, yeah, that could be true. But the third comment that Freud made is the one that baffles me the most. He says, you know what? There's something too mystical about hypnosis as a form of therapy. Now, this was at the turn of the century, between the 19th and 20th century. And that was the era, anti-religion era, because science, as you know it today, science as in the scientific method, was a nascent, was a new baby that had to be protected. And all of the philosophers of the time were doing their best to separate scientific endeavors from religious or spiritual endeavors, because they thought, look, if we keep on mixing the two, science is never going to take off. And Ernst Mach, the guy you know from the engineer, the physicist, he was a philosopher, and all of them were writing papers advocating for this split between spirituality and science. And Freud, of course, was writing at that time, and he says, look, this is a bit too mystical here, so let's separate these two things. Let's do something a little bit more scientific. And he came up with pseudo-hypnosis, aka free association and psychoanalysis. But the rest is history, right? That was transformed. Later the behaviorists developed psychology into something a little bit different. And the most awesome thing that happened, I think, is the beginning in Germany of this idea of experimental psychology. Wundt was a big figure in that beginning, where they began to study people in the laboratory. How do people actually work, the mind and the senses and so forth? So experimental psychology, a great field of study in the 20th century. All right, so that's the stuff there. And meanwhile, what happened to hypnosis? It remained a mental phenomenon, just like Freud. Freud talked about the unconscious, the subconscious, so hypnosis became known as the technique that we can use to bypass the critical faculty, thus connecting the conscious mind to the unconscious mind. So everything that I don't know about myself, because it's in my unconscious, I can have access to in the hypnotic state, if only I can connect the two. So conscious, unconscious, subconscious, all of this terminology is pre-20th century, mind-based terminology. And that's where hypnosis stayed until the 1960s and 70s, when the Hilgards began to do some experiments with people in freezing water. You know, nowadays it's common to do the ice baths and all this. Hilgard was doing this in the 60s. So if you take a person and you dunk them in freezing water, they go into sympathetic activation. And you can easily measure this even in the 60s because blood pressure and heart rate go up immediately. That's the body trying to fight that cold, the freezing cold. So what did he do? He was measuring blood pressure, heart rate, and he would put people's arms in freezing water, and the sympathetic activation was demonstrated by these two biological markers. Okay, so then he started hypnotizing people and telling them the water is comfortable. He would put the arm in the bucket and people would not go into sympathetic activation. Now, anybody can pretend, anybody can be stoic, anybody can be strong and say, I'm okay with this, but the body doesn't lie. The body picks up, and heart rate and blood pressure do go up, even because people measure these things. Even when you think you can tolerate it, and many people can tolerate it, but the body is still responding. While under hypnosis, the body was not responding. So they demonstrated this in the 60s and 70s through a number of studies, thus showing that there's something quite organic about the phenomenon of hypnosis. But that stayed in the literature until 1997, the year Isis was born, her sister. The Spiegel group, the guys from Stanford University in California, they published a paper in Science. Now, if you are into this idea of scientific papers and all, the two most prestigious journals in the world are Science and Nature. So to get a paper published in Science, it is extraordinarily difficult. A ton of people check your results to make sure that it's true before they publish it in Science. Well, this paper was published in 1997 in Science, in the Science Journal. And what they did, and I thought it was a cute thing that Spiegel did, rather than using cold water in his experiments, he used hot water. Same idea, but I guess he didn't want to be repetitive, right? So he used hot water. He would dunk people's hands into painfully hot water and measure, he would hypnotize some people and not others. He hypnotized them all, but some people, the suggestion was, it's very painful. And the other people he would hypnotize and say, it's very comfortable. So same idea, same temperature water, a bunch of people, hypnotize them all one by one. Some people are told it's painful, some people are told it's tolerable. So they would do PET scans. You're all familiar with PET scans. You inject the radioactive sugar solution into the blood, and then you go into this scanner and you can tell what areas of the brain are more active. Very, very useful tool in medicine for cancer, for cardiology. We use this in all kinds of studies. Okay, so he was using PET scans, hypnotizing these people, two different sets of suggestions, put their hands in very hot water, and the somatosensory cortex, the part of the brain that detects pain, lit up in all of them, meaning the water is really, really hot and it's hurting. So they knew that the brain was registering the pain, but the people who were hypnotized and told that it was more painful, the ACC, the anterior cingulate cortex, would light up like a Christmas tree. In other words, they were experiencing the emotional sensation of pain, whereas the people who were hypnotized and told that the water is tolerable were not having the ACC activated. That paper, 1997, in Science, from the Spiegel group from Stanford, proved for the first time with brain imaging studies that hypnosis is real. The argument is over. It's no longer a spiritual conversation. It's no longer a mental phenomenon. It has nothing to do with the unconscious. It's a brain phenomenon. Then another group, the Kesslin group out of Harvard University, published another study in the year 2000 doing something amazing. This paper is even more amazing. Another study using PET scans, same idea. So he would hypnotize people, show them black and white pictures, and tell them that the pictures were colored. Put them under the PET scan. So these people were hypnotized and told them, okay, I'm going to show you a bunch of colored pictures. So when you look at something, the visual cortex activates because you're looking at something. But within the visual cortex, which is in the back of the brain, there's a little tiny area called the gyrus, it's going to come to me in a second, a little tiny part of the visual cortex, which is responsible for interpreting color. So when these people were shown black and white pictures and told the pictures were colored, told under hypnosis, that area of the brain, the gyrus, it's a gyrus, of course, but what it's going to come to me in a second. So that part of the brain would light up. And when they were shown a colored picture, but hypnotized to believe the picture was black and white, the same part of the brain did not light up. So here's the thing, the stimulus, the light coming into the retina, was either colored or non-colored. That cannot be altered. The stimulus was there. The figures were there. The visual cortex as a whole activated. We can see that in the PET scan. But according to the suggestion, the part of the brain responsible for color interpretation would either light up or not light up, not according to the stimulus, but according to the hypnotic suggestion. So that, the year was 2000, that second paper sealed the idea. Hypnosis is a real brain phenomenon. Nobody in neurosciences today questions, nobody who's familiar with the literature questions the idea of hypnosis anymore. That conversation is over. For the past 25 years, 26 years, the conversation is completely over. So the question is, now that we're in the brain era of hypnosis, what can we do with it? Talking about what it is and what we can do with it. Well, let's take a look at, this idea of mind-body, just to take one vein and explore that idea for a little bit. The idea of mind-body medicine, which is in vogue right now. We want to improve our health, we want longevity, we want to live longer, we want to have better function in all regards, right? So the idea of mind-body medicine, or as we say, the idea of mind as medicine. So the first thing that you want to pay attention to there is the idea that the mind does affect the body. This is something that you're all familiar with. You all know that if you look at food that you like, or even if you think of food, particularly if you're hungry, your GI tract changes completely, starting with salivation, but also internal secretions, preparing your body to digest the food. You're all familiar with the fight or flight response, which is that if you see something that is a threat to you, then the physiology changes. But notice, what causes the physiology to change is not exposure to something that to you feels like a threat. It is the mental interpretation that that idea is a threat. Meaning, if a tiger walks in here right now, most of us would go into fight or flight response. We're going to sympathetic activation. We're getting ready to flee and run. But if that tiger happens to be your favorite pet, you don't go into sympathetic activation, which means that it's not the presence of the tiger that changes our physiology, but it is our interpretation of a possible threat. And that's a mental phenomenon. So the mind affects the body. Sexual arousal is another example. All you have to do is think of an idea and the body, the physiology changes. But another more interesting idea, the one that I like to pick on more, is this idea of the placebo response. This past semester, I teach medicine at Queen's University. I'm incoming dean of students in the fall. And this past semester, I taught pharmacology, and we talk a lot about this idea of the placebo response in the context of medicine. And it's a very, very interesting idea because before you can sell a medication, you have to prove that it works. And how do you prove that it works? Well, you do these things called randomized controlled trials and essentially double-blind and all of these other ideas that you're all familiar with. But then the idea is that I'm going to give two groups of people, either the active ingredient that I'm testing, and the other group of people are going to take the inert or the placebo. The placebo looks like the medication, but it isn't. It doesn't contain the active ingredient, the proverbial sugar pill. Right, so I give some people the sugar pill and some people the actual pill. And then I compare results. And then if the active ingredient proves to be statistically superior to the sugar pill, we tell the FDA, look, my medication works. We can sell it. We get approval. We can sell the medication. Fine. So students are often surprised when I ask them, what do you think the percent difference in effectiveness is between the placebo and the active ingredient for the medications that are approved? And it's a few percentage points, 5, 10%. In other words, you give 100 people the placebo, on the average, it varies by study, it varies by medication, it varies by disease state, but on the average, about 40% of the people get better on the sugar pill alone. In other words, I tell people that I have a new medication for headaches. I take 100 people who claim to have headaches. I give them the sugar pill. If they believe they're taking the medication, 40% of them will tell you, I no longer have headaches, and they took the sugar pill. Now, if about 50% of them who took the active ingredient also improve on the headache, then we say, look, the medication is effective. It's better than the placebo. The placebo effect, or the placebo response, as we call it, proves right there what the mind-body effect is all about. Expectation of amelioration, expectation that you're going to do better is enough to make it better. This is a fascinating idea. Now, in one paper that I wrote, I compared how much money is spent on pharmacological research exploiting the placebo response in contrast to how much money is spent collectively as a country on the study of the placebo response itself. It is peanuts as compared to pharmacological research. I'm thinking like $890 million or something a year, which for me it's kind of a lot, but for the country as a whole, it's kind of nothing. And so it's a tiny little drop in the bucket of people actually studying the placebo response. Dude, if 40% of the people get better taking nothing but the sugar pill, let's study that as a medication. And that's not quite what's happening. But it is real. So those are examples of the mind serving as medicine, the mind altering the body. Now, if we take that a step further, you all have heard that your genes define your health. Who has heard of that? Blame your parents. I mean, if you have a genetic condition, it's not your fault. You're born with those genes. Everybody has heard this. Genes, genes, genes. Genes determine your fate. According to your genetics, that's what you inherited. That's what's going on. Well, we have known for about 40, 50 years that that's not the entire picture. True, genes do have something to do with it, but it's not the whole picture, because there's this whole other science called epigenetics, which has to do with the expression or suppression of genes. In other words, a gene is a set of instructions. Think of it as a set of instructions. I may have a gene for a particular disease, but if that gene is not expressed, the disease will never happen. Conversely, if a gene is expressed, the disease will happen, right? So the science that talks about, that studies gene expression or suppression, is called epigenetics, not genetics. And so nowadays they have done all these experiments showing that gene expression can be selectively changed. So there's this guy from Harvard University, Herbert Benson. He started doing some studies on meditation back in the 60s, a physician at Harvard, and they were able to show that meditation can decrease blood pressure, heart rate, and all this stuff, right? So we've known this for many, many, many years. But in the early 2000s, they started publishing papers on the epigenetic effects of mental medicine, or meditation, as they called it. So they would teach people how to meditate and do these genetic assays, and they were able to show that on the average, people could change the expression of genes selectively of 8,000 genes. Now, does anybody know how many genes we have? Like the human genome, how many genes roughly? Before the year 2000, before they came up with the human genome, people estimated that to create a body as complex as a human body would take over 100,000 genes. In other words, 100,000 instructions to create a body. Turned out that it's about 23,000 genes. Biologically, we don't seem to be as complex as we thought we were. 23,000 genes. 15,000 of those genes are ubiquitous. They're in every cell. They have to be expressed for the cell to work. And the other 8,000 are relative to the cell's function. So a liver cell is different from a heart cell, from a kidney cell, and different genes are expressed, and that's why those cells are different. Well, it turns out that an equivalent number of genes can be selectively expressed or suppressed if a person learns to meditate. That is science. That's published. So when you learn to remove yourself from sympathetic activation, just the stress response, when you go into hypnosis and you calm your mind, you're literally telling your body to produce different genes. You're literally changing your physiology. So people talk about anti-aging, which is something that we're all interested in. How can I make my body last longer? The number one thing we need to do is learn how to use the mind differently. Reduce stress, because then different genes will be expressed. Now, everything follows from genes, because genes create proteins, right? So the body is made out of proteins. The bones are made out of collagen, elastin. The skin is made of collagen, elastin. Those are all proteins. And proteins come from genes. So when we learn to use the mind differently, different genes will be expressed, and the body literally begins to change. Now, the number one thing that you hear when people talk about themselves is people say things like, well, I have a bad back. Well, I have bad knees. Think about that from a hypnotic perspective. Now, I'm not talking from the perspective of the orthopedic surgeon. Perhaps in that context, they would say, well, you have bad knees. Perhaps that's what they would say in that context. But think about socially when a person says to you, so-and-so has bad knees or bad back or stuff like this, right? What they're really doing is they're hypnotizing themselves to express the genes that are consistent with that physiological state. And then when they go back and take the x-ray and the doctor confirms and says, yep, I knew it, I have bad knees. Okay, here it is in the x-ray. Well, who created that? In some ways, we do over years of telling ourselves that that's what we have, that's what we are living with. So that's epigenetics. And we can alter your epigenetic state by going into hypnosis. All of us can learn to do this today. The other thing that I want to bring to your attention is this idea of neuroplasticity.